The so-called 1953 coup in Iran, a popular theme with the Western mainstream media when making programs on Iran. What are the facts and what are the media myths about the events that happened in Iran in 1953? I am Ptkin Ázámer, an investigative journalist, with this episode of The Point Is. What happened in Iran in 1953 is often referred to by the Western media as a military coup to topple the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstate the Shah of Iran. Let's start by debunking the first myth with facts. Mossadegh was never democratically elected. He was appointed by the Shah, subject to receiving a vote of confidence by the parliament, as it was written in the constitution of Iran at the time. The next frequently repeated myth is that Prime Minister Mossadegh nationalised Iran's oil. He did lead the parliamentary faction for oil nationalisation, but in fact nationalising Iran's oil was approved by the Iranian parliament before Mossadegh became the Prime Minister, and the Iranian upper chamber, the Senate and the Shah fully endorsed it. Iran's economy during Mossadegh's time was shattered. He had lost popular support and faced impeachment. He decided to preemptively dissolve the parliament and held a referendum riddled with fraud. The Shah issued his dismissal, as was his constitutional right. Mossadegh refused to step down and arrested the general who delivered the Shah's decree. So if there was a coup, it was in fact Mossadegh who tried to seize power by acting illegally against the constitution and refusing the Shah's decree. There was a half-baked plot by the Americans and the British to topple Mossadegh, which started on August the 15th, but that failed. 3 days later, sections of the population, alarmed by the Shah's departure, were led by the clergy and some Iranian army officers who came on the streets and toppled Mossadegh. Much of this was a spontaneous uprising. Many were anxious about the growing power of the Soviet-backed communists in Iran and the economic ruin caused by Mossadegh's policies. The Shah appointed General Zahedi to replace Mossadegh as the Prime Minister. And because Mossadegh had dissolved the parliament, Zahedi was the legal Prime Minister. General Zahedi was a patriotic Iranian and very anti-British, who was in fact interned by the British after their troops occupied Iran during the Second World War. Mossadegh was arrested and tried. In appreciation of Mossadegh's role in the oil nationalisation movement, the Shah used his influence so that he was acquitted of high treason against monarchy and the constitution, which could have resulted in capital punishment for him. Instead, the court sentenced him to 3 years imprisonment for lesser crimes of violating the constitution and ignoring the Shah's decrees. Hardly an act by a bloodthirsty dictator, especially compared with Middle Eastern standards at the time or even today. The Shah was not against oil nationalisation. He opposed the way Mossadegh went about it, which resulted in economic ruin and no oil income coming in. Iran's oil was in fact properly nationalised in 1973 by the Shah himself. And to repeatedly claim the 1953 events are a national trauma for Iranians, what a nonsense. Just compare the dismissal of Mossadegh with what the Russians have done in Iran. Large chunks of Iranian territory were annexed by the Tsarist Russia in the 19th century. Iran's first parliament was shelled by the Russian Cossack colonel Lyakov, who also executed several Iranian constitutionalists in 1908. Iran was occupied by the Soviet Union during the Second World War, and Stalin tried to annex Azerbaijan, the northwestern province of Iran. So how is all that Iran has suffered from Russian interference not a national trauma? But the removal of Mossadegh, which was followed by years of economic prosperity and growth, is considered by the Western media a national trauma for Iranians. And what happened to Mossadegh supporters? What trauma did they suffer after the Islamic Revolution in Iran? Well, many of them became ardent supporters of Khomeini and actively supported the summary executions of the Shah's former officials. But when they lost the power struggle to the clerics, most of them were arrested and jailed. Some were executed and some fled. Those who fled the Islamic Republic went to live in Britain and America. And the point is, when talking about the events of 1953 in Iran, we should get the facts right and let's not draw the wrong conclusions. And the real trauma for Iranians is not what happened in 1953. The real trauma for Iranians is what happened in 1979.